Asterisk, there's something deeply unsettling about the invisible battles that define the modern world. Wars are no longer fought simply with soldiers and tanks, with borders and flags clearly marked. No, today, conflict manifests in hidden ways, in strategies that operate beneath the surface of our awareness, and if you ignore them, you do so at your peril. Now consider this. Imagine a swarm of creatures so small you can hardly notice them. Bees, not the natural kind, not the buzzing pollinators that keep the world alive, but machines, artificial, engineered, designed with one purpose. They are weapons, but weapons without uniforms, without morality, without conscience. And here's the question you must ask yourself. What happens when the tools of creation, technology, innovation, progress are harnessed for destruction, when the very symbols of life, like bees, become agents of death? That is the essence of what we're going to examine today: the invisible war, India's secret weapon, and the terrifying possibility of robotic bees capable of bringing even a superpower like America to its knees. Asterisk, when people think of war, they imagine something tangible: soldiers marching in unison, tanks rumbling across battlefields, jets screaming overhead. That's the image we've inherited from the 20th century. But today, war has changed its shape. It has become invisible, harder to detect, and infinitely more insidious. And that's what makes it far more dangerous. An invisible war doesn't announce itself with a declaration. It doesn't start with a bomb dropping or a flag being raised. It begins quietly, often without anyone recognizing it until it is already too late. We are entering an era where power is not defined by the sheer size of armies, but by the sophistication of ideas, the mastery of technology, and the ability to control information. The battle is psychological as much as it is physical. It's fought in cyberspace, in laboratories, in think tanks, and in the very fabric of culture itself. An invisible war doesn't just destroy infrastructure. It undermines confidence, corrodes trust, and destabilizes nations from within. What makes this terrifying is precisely its subtlety. You can't fight what you can't see. If a nation drops a missile on your city, you know immediately that you've been attacked. But if the strike comes through manipulation of data, or through engineered drones disguised as something ordinary, or even through the silent collapse of social cohesion, how do you respond? By the time you realize what's happening, the damage has already been done. That's the essence of invisibility. It operates under the radar of awareness. And here's something crucial. Human beings are wired to respond to what is obvious. We see the tiger in the jungle, and we run. We hear the sound of gunfire, and we hide. But we're not well equipped to perceive threats that manifest slowly, indirectly, and abstractly. When war hides itself in disguise, whether as technology, economic pressure, or robotic swarms, we are psychologically unprepared to recognize it. That asymmetry is precisely what makes the invisible war such a devastating tool. Think about this. Civilizations collapse not only because of direct attacks, but because of what they fail to see. Rome didn't fall in a single night. It decayed slowly, invisibly, from within corruption, complacency, and hidden forces eroding its foundations, and we are no different. When the weapons of war are invisible, society often dismisses the threat as science fiction or paranoia, until reality forces recognition. That's why the concept of an invisible war should terrify us. It suggests that the battlefield is everywhere and nowhere, that the weapons are deployed without sound, without smoke, without warning. The most dangerous battles of the future may not even look like battles. They'll appear as technical glitches, sudden economic collapses, swarms of robotic insects you can't even distinguish from nature itself. By the time the victim understands they've been attacked, the war has already been lost. The bee is one of nature's most profound symbols. For thousands of years, it has stood as a representation of life itself, fertility, order, and the fragile balance upon which human survival depends. Without bees, the ecosystem collapses because they are the silent architects of abundance. They pollinate our crops, sustain our food supply, and embody a principle that life thrives through cooperation, discipline, and quiet labor. To take something with such inherent goodness and re-engineer it into a weapon is not merely technological innovation. It is a profound moral inversion. It represents the corruption of life's symbols into instruments of destruction. Now think about what it means when we transform bees, those tiny creatures upon which human civilization is literally dependent, into robotic assassins. It is a perverse distortion of nature. Instead of preserving life, we bend its very image into a tool for annihilation. The bee becomes no longer a bringer of harvest, but a harbinger of collapse. And this is no trivial matter, because when you weaponize a symbol of life, you don't just attack your enemy's body, you attack their psyche, you blur the line between what gives life and what takes it away. That confusion destabilizes the very categories by which people make sense of the world. Human beings live by stories and metaphors as much as by bread. Bees symbolize hard work, sacrifice for the hive, and the delicate interconnectedness of existence. But robotic bees, built with the intention to destroy, invert that meaning entirely. Suddenly, the hive is not a symbol of unity but of surveillance. The swarm is no longer the protector of food and fertility, but an army of drones with the potential to dismantle power grids, infiltrate secure facilities, or carry toxins into the bloodstream of entire populations. The image of the bee, once a gentle reminder of life's fragility, becomes a terrifying vision of how technology can corrupt even nature's most sacred archetypes. And this corruption carries a deeper message. Once we cross the line of turning symbols of life into weapons of war, there is no going back. The psychological impact is irreversible. Imagine a child growing up in a world where bees no longer represent springtime, honey, or flowers, but death, surveillance, and fear. That distortion damages not only the way we relate to nature, but the way we relate to meaning itself. And meaning is the foundation of civilization. So when we speak of robotic bees as weapons, we're not just speaking about machines. We're speaking about an assault on the symbolic order that has grounded human consciousness for millennia. That's what makes this so dangerous. It isn't only about the physical capacity to harm, it's about the metaphysical cost of corrupting the very images that sustain our understanding of life. In that sense, weaponized bees are more than a tool of war. They are a sign of cultural decay, of moral blindness, and of the dangerous arrogance that emerges when humanity believes it can play God with creation itself. Power has always been the central concern of human beings. In the past, it was measured by the size of armies, the wealth of nations, or the reach of empires. Today, however, the true measure of power has shifted. It is no longer determined primarily by how many men you can place on the battlefield or how many ships you can send across the ocean. Instead, it is determined by the sophistication of your technology, by the brilliance of your innovation, and by your ability to wield knowledge in ways that others cannot predict or defend against. Technology has become the ultimate equalizer and, at the same time, the ultimate destabilizer. Consider the implications of this shift. A small group of engineers working quietly in a laboratory can design machines with the capacity to undermine an entire nation. That is a radically new kind of warfare. You don't need vast armies or sprawling empires anymore. You need precision, you need intelligence, and you need the ruthless determination to apply technology not toward creation, but toward destruction. The result is a kind of power that is invisible, decentralized, and frighteningly effective. This transformation also exposes something deeply paradoxical about human nature. We invent tools to make life easier, safer, and more abundant. Yet at the same time, we cannot resist the temptation to weaponize those very tools. Fire gave us warmth and light, but it also gave us war and devastation. Nuclear energy offered the promise of near-limitless power, but it also produced weapons capable of annihilating the planet. Now, the same logic applies to robotics, artificial intelligence, and bioengineering. Each step forward in technological advancement carries within it the shadow of destruction. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. Technology as power is especially dangerous because it obscures the line between offense and defense. A robotic bee designed to pollinate crops can easily be reprogrammed to deliver toxins. Artificial intelligence designed to optimize health care can be turned into an instrument of surveillance and control. Once technology exists, its application is limited only by human imagination, and human imagination has always included both the capacity for creation and the appetite for domination. What this means, practically speaking, is that power has slipped from the hands of the few obvious rulers and into the hands of anyone capable of harnessing complex tools that makes the world unstable. A single nation, or even a single group, can now hold the kind of power that once belonged only to superpowers. That shift alters the entire geopolitical landscape. It creates uncertainty. It destabilizes the balance of fear that once kept wars contained. And it amplifies the risk that destruction can emerge not from the predictable moves of empires, but from the unpredictable innovations of the few. So when we talk about technology as power, we are not just talking about machines. We are talking about a transformation in the very nature of human conflict. Power has become more intelligent, more subtle, and more difficult to detect. And that makes it not only more effective, but also far more terrifying. Human beings have always struggled with morality, with distinguishing good from evil, creation from destruction. But technology has introduced a peculiar kind of blindness, a blindness not of sight, but of conscience. Machines themselves have no moral compass. They don't understand suffering, justice, or responsibility. They only follow the commands written into them. And when we begin to rely on machines as tools of war, we risk divorcing ourselves from the very moral responsibility that has, at least in principle, restrained human violence. Consider the difference between a soldier and a machine. A soldier, even in the chaos of battle, retains a shred of humanity. He knows fear, he understands compassion, he might hesitate before pulling the trigger. That hesitation, however small, is the echo of conscience. But a robotic swarm programmed with an objective feels nothing. It does not hesitate, it does not reflect. It executes its task with cold precision, indifferent to the suffering it produces. That is the essence of moral blindness, violence divorced from the possibility of conscience. And this blindness doesn't only apply to the machines themselves. It applies equally, if not more so, to the people who create and deploy them. When destruction is carried out by something mechanical, it is easier to rationalize. The programmer writes code, the engineer builds the machine, the politician authorizes its use, and no one feels directly responsible for the human cost. The blood is still spilled, but the hands appear clean. This diffusion of responsibility allows moral corruption to spread unnoticed. Everyone plays their role, and yet no one admits guilt. That is how atrocities take root. This is not new. History is filled with examples of people who justified horrors because they hid behind systems, structures, and machinery. Bureaucrats signing papers in Nazi Germany didn't see themselves as murderers, yet their signatures sealed millions of fates. The technology was different, but the psychology was the same. Responsibility diluted until it disappears. Now, with robotic weapons, that same phenomenon is amplified. The distance between the human decision maker and the act of killing grows so great that conscience can be silenced completely. The danger is that once moral blindness sets in, there is no natural limit to violence. If there is no hesitation, no guilt, no sense of restraint, then destruction becomes purely a question of efficiency. How quickly can the machines be produced? How effectively can they execute their tasks? How thoroughly can they dismantle an enemy? Once morality is removed from the equation, war becomes mathematics, and mathematics has no mercy. That is why moral blindness in the age of robotic warfare is so terrifying. It represents not just a new kind of weapon, but a new way of thinking about violence, one in which killing is automated, sanitized, and stripped of conscience. And if we lose conscience in war, we lose one of the last fragile barriers separating civilization from barbarism. For most of history, the global balance of power was relatively predictable. Empires rose because they commanded vast armies, controlled essential resources, or occupied strategic territory. Superpowers dominated because they could project strength across oceans and continents, because their wealth and their size were undeniable. But the emergence of new technologies has altered that balance in ways that are both unprecedented and destabilizing. The geopolitical landscape is shifting, and the ground beneath our feet is less solid than it once appeared. The key fact is this: power is no longer determined solely by scale. You don't need to be the richest nation or the largest empire to wield devastating influence. In the modern world, a small country, or even a small faction within a country, can acquire or develop technologies capable of crippling a superpower. That represents a radical change. It means that the old hierarchies of global dominance are under threat, and the stability we once took for granted is increasingly fragile. Think of it this way: America's military power rests on its sheer size, on its aircraft carriers, its global bases, its satellites, its nuclear arsenal. But what happens if an adversary, working quietly and invisibly, develops something like robotic swarms, tiny machines capable of infiltrating borders, disrupting systems, or dismantling infrastructure without ever declaring war? Suddenly, the weight of traditional power becomes less relevant. $1 trillion military might be paralyzed by $1 billion innovation. That is the essence of the geopolitical shift: asymmetry. The small can wound the great, not by matching its strength, but by undermining its vulnerabilities. This asymmetry creates new tensions. Superpowers, once secure in their dominance, now face enemies they cannot easily predict or deter. A swarm of robotic bees, deployed covertly, doesn't carry a national flag. It doesn't come with a warning. Who do you retaliate against when the enemy is hidden, decentralized, or disguised as something entirely natural? That ambiguity weakens deterrence, it invites risk, and it encourages smaller powers to act boldly, knowing they can strike without triggering immediate retaliation. But the shift is not only military. It's also psychological and political. Nations once considered marginal can suddenly influence the decisions of giants, not because of their armies but because of their technologies. That redistribution of influence undermines the old order and creates a new one where unpredictability rules. In such a world, no one can be certain of their security, not even the most powerful. That uncertainty breeds fear, and fear breeds instability. And so, the geopolitical shift brought about by invisible weapons like robotic bees is not merely a question of who wins or loses a battle. It is a transformation in the nature of global relations. It signals the collapse of predictable hierarchies and the rise of an era where power is distributed in ways we cannot yet fully comprehend. That instability is dangerous because when no nation feels secure, the temptation to act preemptively, to strike first, before being struck, is overwhelming. And history has shown us that such instability almost always leads to catastrophe. Civilization is often imagined as something solid, something permanent, something that can withstand any storm, but in reality it is extraordinarily fragile. What we call civilization is nothing more than a thin layer of order stretched over a vast abyss of chaos. It is maintained not by inevitability, but by constant vigilance, discipline, and a collective willingness to uphold fragile structures. Our laws, our institutions, our moral codes. The moment we forget this, the moment we assume civilization is indestructible, is the very moment it begins to collapse. The danger of invisible weapons like robotic bees is that they expose just how delicate our systems really are. Modern societies depend on a web of interconnections: food supply chains, power grids, communication networks, transportation systems. These structures function so seamlessly that we barely notice them, but remove even a single piece and the entire web can unravel. If crops fail, cities go hungry. If power grids collapse, hospitals fail, economies shut down, and chaos spreads within days. A single well-executed invisible strike can unravel centuries of progress, not through brute force, but by quietly severing the threads that hold civilization together. This fragility is compounded by human psychology. People assume that tomorrow will look like today, that order will persist because it always has, but this is a dangerous illusion. History is filled with examples of societies that collapsed abruptly when pressures exceeded their ability to adapt. The Roman Empire, the Mayans, countless civilizations fell not because they lacked strength, but because they assumed their strength was permanent. They mistook fragility for stability, and we are at risk of making the same mistake. Robotic swarms embody this risk because they don't need to conquer armies to bring down nations. They only need to disrupt the hidden systems that make daily life possible. Imagine bees that poison crops instead of pollinating them, or machines that infiltrate power stations and disable entire regions. The collapse would not appear first as war, it would appear as famine, blackout, disease, or panic. By the time people realized what had happened, the civilization they depended on would already be disintegrating. The true terror here is not just the physical destruction, but the psychological collapse that follows. Once people lose faith in the reliability of their systems, chaos takes over, trust evaporates, panic spreads faster than the initial damage, and civilization is, at its core, a structure built on trust. Trust in your neighbor, in your institutions, in the stability of tomorrow. When that trust is broken, order gives way to chaos almost overnight. That is why we must never underestimate the fragility of civilization. We stand on foundations that appear solid, but are, in truth, brittle. And invisible weapons, precisely because they are unseen until it is too late, have the unique capacity to shatter those foundations without warning. The lesson is simple: strength is never permanent, and survival is never guaranteed. If we ignore that truth, we risk watching the entire structure of our civilization collapse in silence, undone not by an obvious enemy, but by a threat we fail to see.